For the Son of Man is to go just as it is written of him. But woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been good for that man if he had not been born. Jewish leaders had a man who would betray Jesus into their hands for 30 pieces of silver, basically the price of a slave. Now it was just a matter of figuring out how to pull it off. After supper, we pick up the story in verse 32. It says the entourage, Jesus and the disciples, came to a place named Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here until I have prayed." And he took with him Peter and James and John and began to be very distressed and troubled. And he said to them, "My soul is deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and keep watch." And he went a little beyond them and fell to the ground and began to pray that if it were possible, the hour might pass him by. And he was saying, "Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will." And he came and found them sleeping and said to Peter, "Simon, are you asleep? Could you not keep watch for 1 hour? Keep watching and praying that you may not come into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." Again he went away and prayed, saying the same words, and again he came and found them sleeping. For their eyes were very heavy, and they did not know what to answer him. And he came the third time and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? It is enough. The hour has come. Behold, the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up. Let us be going. Behold, the one who betrays me is at hand." In that moment, at verse 42, Judas and the entourage appear. And the text that I want you to look at particularly is verses 43 to 52. We're going to consider the betrayal and arrest of Jesus. Immediately, while he was still speaking, Judas, one still speaking to the 12, one of the 12 came up accompanied by a crowd with swords and clubs, who were from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. Now he who was betraying him had given them a signal, saying, "Whomever I kiss, he is the one. Seize him and lead him away under guard." After coming, Judas immediately went to him, saying, "Rabbi," and kissed him. And they laid hands on him and seized him. But one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. And Jesus said to them, "Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me as you would against a robber? Every day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But this has taken place to fulfill the Scriptures." And they, meaning the disciples, all left him and fled. A young man was following him, wearing nothing but a linen sheet over his naked body. They seized him, but he pulled free of the linen sheet and escaped naked. What a sad, ugly, bizarre, dramatic, poignant scene. The betrayal and arrest of Jesus. With this, the execution of Jesus is placed into motion from the human standpoint, and this is exactly on God's timetable. In verse 43, we we see the crowd that showed up. And just to understand what kind of a crowd it was, we'll look a little closer at it. Judas, one of the 12, came up accompanied by a crowd with swords and clubs, who were from the chief priests and scribes and elders. I guess the most tragic statement that I can see in that verse is Judas being identified as one of the 12. That is the ultimate tragedy. One of the 12, the greatest opportunity and privilege any human being could ever have, to be with the Lord for 3 years. And he had shaken off all of that privilege and left the upper room earlier and gone to negotiate this moment. Matthew chapter 26, verses 14 to 16 talks about how he negotiates the price. It is now for Judas a very frantic night. A meeting with the Sanhedrin, negotiating the price, getting permission from Roman authorities to gather some soldiers to go so that there is protection. Maybe even permission had to have been gained from Pilate. This is a full-blown enterprise for Judas. All for 30 pieces of silver. So he leads the crowd into the area of the Garden of Gethsemane on the Mount of Olives. And it's a formidable crowd. Just to add to what it says about a crowd with swords and clubs, chief priests, scribes, elders. That's the Jewish part. John 18:3 says there was a cohort of Roman soldiers. A cohort, a spiron in Greek, is a tenth of a legion. 6,000 Romans were in a legion, so this could be 600 soldiers armed. Extra troops were, of course, stationed in Jerusalem for Passover crowds, which were massive crowds compared to the normal part of the year. And they had recently actually put down an insurrection led by a man named Barabbas, whom you will remember. These soldiers would have been under control and command of a Chiliarch. They would have been associated with Fort Antonia, which was located, the Roman fort, on the north edge of the temple ground. John says they came with torches and lanterns and weapons. Mark here tells us they came with swords and clubs. Swords, the Roman MacArthur. Clubs, zola, which was basically a baton. You might call it a billy club or some kind of a nightstick used by Jewish temple police to hit those who are out of line. So this armed crowd comes to secure this one individual. And they're all there in order to quell any middle-of-the-night resistance. They couldn't have hoped for a better time, middle of the night when everybody was asleep. This is a mindless, cowardly, profane assembly of people, led by the greatest human tragedy ever, Judas. They arrive in verse 44, and we see immediately that he who was betraying him, notice, was betraying him. It was a process, as I said, that he had gone through the night. He who was betraying him had given them a signal, saying, "Whomever I kiss, he is the one. Seize him and lead him away under guard." There was no way to recognize Jesus in the dark of the garden. In spite of what you might have seen in some medieval painting, he did not have a halo. He did not have an aura. They would not be able to identify him in the dark unless someone pointed him out. And Judas, with amazing boldness, says the sign will be a kiss. Now, that's not a kiss on the lips. That is a strong embrace. A sign of love, a sign of honor, a sign of respect, a sign of affection, a sign of friendship, a sign of loyalty. The inferiors in ancient times kissed the hand, slaves kissed the feet, equals kissed the cheek or the head. This is hypocrisy at its ugliest. Bizarre effort to conceal his treachery from Jesus, thinking he could hide behind his shallow gesture. Jesus knew him well. Jesus had already said he was a devil. The man of sorrows had many sorrows. This was surely one of the deepest. Verse 45 says, after coming or arriving, we could say, Judas immediately went to him saying, Rabbi, and kissed him. And if you're looking at your own mind and your own conscience and wondering, how could he be that bold? You have to remember that according to Luke 22 in verse 3, that same night Satan had entered Judas. Satan had entered Judas. Maybe Judas on his own could not have behaved in this way. Maybe Judas on his own could not have brought himself to this gesture. But a Satan-controlled Judas really was not in control. First he says rabbi, which means teacher. That's a familiar title for the Lord. And kissed him. And by the way, kata phileo, it's an embrace of friendship, and it is to kiss someone fervently, a prolonged gesture of affection. So that everybody would know exactly who Jesus was, and they could arrest him. Luke 22:48, Jesus said to him, Luke tells us, Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? The Lord knew it all along. Matthew 26:50, friend, Jesus said, do what you have come for. And by the way, when he said friend, he didn't use philius, which is the normal word for friend, such as in John 15:15. He used a word that's kind of a distant word, etare. It means, I suppose, comrade, fellow, nothing intimate. Jesus did not destroy Judas on the spot. He did not incinerate him into ashes. Rather, he submitted to the shame of this betrayal because it was the Father's will. And as we saw earlier in verse 36, Jesus had said, not what I will, but what you will. Mark says no more about Judas. This is the last place where Judas appears in the Gospel of Mark. But Matthew fills in the story. Matthew 27 tells us he went out and hanged himself after he had thrown down the money, trying to give it back to the leaders. And Acts 1:18 says that his entire body was smashed and gushed out on the rocks. The combination of those two means he tried to hang himself, obviously, over some cliff, and the branch broke, and both are true. He hanged himself, and he was crushed on the rocks below. He's the greatest illustration of wasted opportunity. So Jesus is identified. To understand the full story, I have to draw your attention to the 18th chapter of the Gospel of John. Because immediately after this, you can just listen starting in verse 3. Judas then, having received the Roman cohort and officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, came with lanterns and torches and weapons. So Jesus, knowing all the things that were coming upon him, went forth and said to them, Jesus approached them. Whom do you seek? They answered, Jesus the Nazarene. He said to them, I am he. And Judas also, who was betraying him, was standing with them. So when he said to them, I am he drew back and fell. They drew back and fell to the ground. When he said to the crowd, I am he, they fell over. Verse 7, he asked them again, whom do you seek? And they said, Jesus the Nazarene. Jesus answered, I told you that I am he. So if you seek me, let these go their way. What's he doing here? He's saying, you've come for me and only me, and you have no right to take the disciples. He's protecting the disciples who at this point are so weak they couldn't possibly survive an arrest. This is protection. And he tells us that in verse 9. Jesus protected them to fulfill the word which he spoke, of those whom you have given me, I lost not one. That's an amazing statement. Those who belong to Jesus cannot be lost. Not because they're not capable of being lost, but because he will never let them be in a situation that would result in their defection. They're mine, and as weak as they are, I'm going to hold on to them. But imagine that entire entourage collapsing to the ground just because Jesus said, essentially, I am. The name of God.